The message came at 8:14 on a Tuesday morning while I was standing in the executive parking garage staring at a stain spreading across the concrete from somebody's leaking radiator fluid. I remember that detail because everything else after that moment became difficult to separate cleanly. The garage smelled faintly like rainwater and motor oil. My phone buzzed once. Then again. Family group chat. I almost ignored it because my mother usually used the group chat for passive-aggressive birthday reminders or photos from charity lunches where she pretended our family was emotionally functional. But the preview alone stopped me cold.
Dad.
After recent events, your mother, and I no longer trust you. Then immediately underneath it.
Mom.
Please do not contact us until we decide how to move forward. And then, nothing. No explanation. No accusation, and no phone call. Just exile.
Clean.
Polite.
Public.
The fluorescent lights above me flickered softly, while somewhere 3 floors lower a car alarm chirped twice. I stared at the screen long enough for it to dim in my hand. Then my younger cousin Melissa reacted to the message with a sad face emoji. A minute later my aunt reacted with prayer hands. That was the moment humiliation arrived. Because everyone else already seemed to know what I had supposedly done. And I was somehow the last person finding out. I unlocked my car slowly and sat inside without turning the engine on. My hands stayed steady. That scared me more than panic would have. Part of me already understood something dangerous was happening. I reread the messages 4 more times. Recent events. What events? The wording bothered me because my father worked in corporate law for 30 years. He chose language carefully, which meant every word inside those texts had been discussed beforehand. And deep down, before I consciously realized it, another thought surfaced. This had something to do with Sterling developments. Because for the past 7 years, I had quietly become the operational backbone of my family's company while everyone publicly pretended my older sister Jada was the genius heir apparent. That was the arrangement. Jada got visibility. I got responsibility. She appeared in magazines. I stayed in conference rooms fixing problems she created. And, until that moment, I thought I had accepted that role. If you're listening right now, tell me where you're watching from because honestly, stories like this hit differently when you've grown up inside families where appearances mattered more than truth. And if you've ever been blamed before you even got the chance to defend yourself, hit like and subscribe. Because this story didn't start with screaming. It started with one message. And 3 days later, my entire family empire began collapsing. My name is Alyssa Sterling. At the time all this happened, I was 34 years old and serving as Senior Operations Director for Sterling Developments, my father's commercial real estate company based in Charlotte, North Carolina. Officially, my sister Jada was being prepared to take over eventually. Unofficially, everyone inside the company knew I was the one keeping things functional. I handled compliance reviews, vendor disputes, contract reconciliation, internal audits, regulatory filings. The things nobody celebrated publicly, because successful companies are usually held together by invisible work. Jada handled branding, interviews, networking events, social media campaigns. And to be fair, she was exceptional at looking successful. People loved her immediately. She had that effortless confidence that made strangers trust her within minutes. Meanwhile, I was the daughter my parents described as solid, reliable, practical, emotionally mature, which sounds complimentary until you realize those words often become excuses for neglect. 3 weeks before the text message, we had dinner at my parents' lake house outside Davidson. At the time, it felt normal. Now I replay the entire evening differently. My mother had invited several investors and their spouses. Jada arrived 40 minutes late wearing white despite it not remotely being the kind of event where white made sense. My father still stood immediately when she entered.
There she is, he said proudly.
Like she'd returned from war instead of valet parking. I smiled politely from the other side of the table. Normal. Everything always followed the same pattern. Then midway through dinner, one investor casually mentioned the city compliance review currently happening on one of our downtown projects. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Very slightly, but enough for me to notice. Jada took a sip of wine too quickly. My father answered before I could. Routine paperwork issue. he said smoothly. I frowned a little, because that wasn't true. It wasn't catastrophic either, but it definitely wasn't routine. Earlier that week, I'd flagged irregular subcontractor payments tied to the project. Missing documentation. Inflated invoices. Wire transfers routed strangely. I'd emailed both my father and Jada requesting clarification. Neither responded. At the time, I assumed avoidance. Now I understand it was fear. The morning after the family text, I arrived at the office expecting awkwardness. Instead, I walked into silence. The receptionist barely met my eyes. 2 project managers abruptly stopped talking when I entered the hallway. And then I noticed something else. My security badge wasn't working. I tried again. Red light. Again. Red light. That cold electronic denial sound echoed louder than it should have. Then Greg from internal IT appeared beside the lobby desk, looking deeply uncomfortable. Alyssa, what happened? He swallowed hard. I was instructed to suspend executive access, pending review. Pending review. Corporate language. Always cleaner than the truth. I stared at him. By who? He hesitated too long, which answered the question already. My father. Greg looked miserable. Alyssa, I'm really sorry. Humiliation feels strange when it happens slowly. People imagine explosive moments, but usually it's smaller. A receptionist pretending not to hear. A coworker avoiding eye contact. A badge failing publicly. Tiny social signals telling you power has shifted before anyone officially explains why. And standing there in the lobby, I realized something horrifying. Everyone else had already been told a version of the story. Except me. Within 20 minutes, I was sitting inside a glass conference room with HR Director Cynthia Morales and one outside attorney I'd never seen before. That part mattered immediately. Outside attorney meant liability. Cynthia folded her hands carefully. Alyssa, concerns have been raised regarding unauthorized financial approvals connected to the Riverside expansion accounts. I actually laughed once. Not emotionally. In disbelief. Unauthorized by who? The attorney answered instead. We're conducting a formal review. That's not an answer. Cynthia avoided my eyes. We have reason to believe internal procedures may have been bypassed. By me? Silence. Then the attorney slid a folder across the table. And the second I opened it, my stomach dropped. Because the approval signatures inside looked like mine. But they weren't. Not exactly. Close enough to survive surface review. Different enough for me to know instantly they'd been replicated. Someone had forged authorization approvals using old digital signature templates. And suddenly one realization hit me with brutal clarity. This wasn't suspicion. This was preparation. I kept turning pages slowly. Wire transfers. Vendor releases. Payment approvals. Then I saw the subcontractor company receiving the funds. Marrow Holdings, LLC. My pulse slowed instantly. Because I knew that company. Not professionally. Personally. Jada created Marrow Holdings 2 years earlier during one of her private investment ventures. Which meant one thing. Either my sister was unbelievably reckless, or somebody was setting me up using her shell company as camouflage. Neither possibility felt survivable. I looked up slowly. Where's Jada? The attorney answered carefully. She's cooperating fully.
Cooperating.
Interesting word. I leaned back in my chair. So she accused me first. Cynthia finally spoke quietly. Alyssa, this doesn't have to become adversarial. That sentence nearly made me angry enough to smile. Because people only say don't make this adversarial when they already picked a side. I closed the folder carefully. Did my father authorize this meeting? Yes. And he didn't speak to me himself? No answer. That silence hurt more than I expected. Driving home later, I kept replaying one detail repeatedly. The forged signatures weren't sophisticated enough to fool forensic review, which meant whoever created them either panicked or assumed nobody would investigate deeply. And suddenly another memory surfaced. 2 months earlier, I'd quietly flagged irregular land acquisition expenses tied to one of Jada's luxury redevelopment projects. When I brought it to my father privately, he dismissed it immediately. Don't micromanage your sister. At the time, I backed off.
Now?
I think that was the first moment they realized I might accidentally expose something much larger. At 11:40 that night, my phone rang from an unknown number. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. Alyssa? Deep male voice. Controlled. Older. Yes. This is Arthur Bell. I sat upright instantly. Arthur Bell was my grandfather's former legal advisor, retired now, and fiercely loyal to my grandfather long before my father inherited Sterling Developments. Arthur spoke quietly. You need to stop communicating through company channels immediately. Every nerve in my body sharpened. Arthur, what's happening? Your father is trying to contain exposure before federal auditors arrive. The room went completely still around me. Federal auditors?
No.
Impossible. Arthur continued carefully. And if you don't protect yourself quickly, they're going to let you absorb this alone. What exactly did Jada do? Then, the sentence that changed everything. Alyssa, your sister didn't act alone. At exactly that moment, another message appeared on my phone. From my mother. Only 6 words. Turn on the news right now. I grabbed the remote. And there on the local business channel was my sister Jada standing beside my father outside Sterling headquarters while reporters surrounded them. Then my father said the sentence that shattered whatever remained of my trust in him. We were devastated to discover financial misconduct inside our own company. And behind him, on the giant screen visible to every camera, was my employee photograph. The news clip replayed every 20 minutes for the next 48 hours. Public humiliation spreads faster when there's a familiar narrative attached to it. Privileged executive. Internal fraud. Family betrayal. People love stories where success secretly rots underneath. And my father knew that, which is why he positioned himself perfectly during the press conference.
Calm.
Disappointed. Responsible. The grieving patriarch cleaning corruption inside his own company. Meanwhile, my face rotated across local business channels beside words like financial misconduct, internal investigation, executive review. Technically, nobody directly called me guilty. They didn't need to. Implication is cleaner than accusation because it protects people legally while destroying someone socially. And by the second morning, my professional reputation was already collapsed. I found out accidentally. That was the humiliating part. Not through some official notice. Not through honesty. I found out because recruiter emails stopped overnight. For years, recruiters contacted me constantly. Operations directors, compliance leads, regional consulting firms. Then suddenly, nothing. Even worse, people started canceling meetings already scheduled. One hiring manager from Atlanta emailed, due to recent developments, we've decided to move in another direction. Recent developments. Corporate language again. Soft words covering deliberate isolation. I sat in my kitchen staring at the email while rain tapped softly against the windows. The apartment felt strangely unfamiliar suddenly, like scandal changes physical space too. Then my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. I answered cautiously. Alyssa? Female voice.
Soft.
Nervous. This is Nina from Hargrove Consulting. Off the record, your name's circulating internally. My stomach tightened. What are they saying? Long pause. That federal investigators may already be involved. The room went silent around me, because only one group of people could have leaked that narrative intentionally. My family. That was the first moment I truly understood something ugly. They weren't just protecting the company. They were sacrificing me strategically. Because if public suspicion attached firmly enough to one executive, regulators might stop digging deeper. And inside Sterling Developments, I was the perfect candidate. Operational access. Financial oversight background. Enough authority to sound believable. But not enough public visibility for investors to panic. I wasn't just convenient. I was engineered for blame. I finally called my mother that evening. Not emotional. Focused. She answered on the 4th ring. Alyssa. Her tone sounded exhausted.
Performatively exhausted.
Why is my face on television? Long silence. Then softly. You should have cooperated sooner. I almost laughed. Cooperated with what? Alyssa,
No.
explain it clearly. I stood near my kitchen, counter-gripping the phone hard enough my fingers hurt. What exactly are you accusing me of? My mother exhaled shakily. There are financial inconsistencies connected to your department. Created by who? No answer. That's silence again. Always silence where truth should have been. Then she said, your father is trying to protect the company. And there it was. Not protect me. Not find truth.
Protect the company.
I closed my eyes briefly. So, I'm collateral. Alyssa, please don't speak emotionally. That sentence snapped something cold into place inside me. Because my mother had spent my entire life reframing my reactions instead of addressing behavior. If I cried, I was dramatic. If I questioned things, I was difficult. If I noticed patterns, I was sensitive. Meanwhile, Jada detonated entire relationships and somehow remained misunderstood. Did Dad know about Marrow Holdings? Complete silence. Then, she hung up. At 9:12 p.m., Arthur Bell arrived at my apartment unexpectedly. He wore the same charcoal overcoat I remembered from my grandfather's funeral 8 years earlier.
Neat.
Controlled. Deliberate. He carried a leather document case under one arm. The second I opened the door, he said quietly, do not let anyone inside your apartment unless you personally trust them. No greeting. No pleasantries. Immediate warning. I stepped aside silently. Arthur entered slowly, looking older than I remembered, but still sharply observant. He sat at my dining table and placed the leather case down carefully. Then he looked directly at me. Alyssa, how much do you know? Almost nothing. That's probably why you're still safe. The words landed heavily. I sat across from him. Arthur, what's actually happening? He opened the case. Inside were copies of transaction reports, property acquisition maps, internal correspondence, and one spreadsheet highlighted heavily in yellow. I recognized it instantly, because I created the original version 3 years ago during an audit review. Except this version contained additional columns I'd never seen before. Offshore routing accounts. My pulse slowed immediately. Arthur tapped one line carefully. Your father and sister have been diverting development funds through shell vendors for at least 4 years. No. Yes. That's impossible. I reviewed these accounts personally. You reviewed edited versions. The room felt suddenly colder. Rain hammered harder outside the windows now, while traffic lights reflected red across wet glass. Arthur leaned back slowly. Your father never expected regulators to look deeply because Sterling's political relationships protected them for years. Then what changed? Arthur's expression hardened. Your sister got greedy. Arthur handed me another document. Luxury property acquisitions. Private transfers. Unreported commissions. Amounts large enough to trigger federal attention instantly. And every trail eventually led back to Jada. She started moving money too aggressively, Arthur said quietly. Especially after the Miami project. I looked up sharply. The Miami project lost money. That's what shareholders were told. A sick feeling crawled slowly through my chest. Because I remembered that project vividly. Cost overruns. Emergency restructuring. Jada blaming contractors publicly. My father defending her relentlessly. Arthur continued. The project didn't lose money. Funds were extracted. How much? He looked at me carefully before answering. Close to 27 million. I genuinely stopped breathing for a second. 27 million. Not accounting fraud. Not technical misconduct. Federal-level fraud. And suddenly another horrifying realization surfaced. Dad knew. Arthur didn't answer immediately, which answered enough already. Finally, he said softly, Alyssa, your father built the structure. I stood abruptly and walked toward the kitchen because suddenly sitting felt impossible. My father taught me business ethics personally. He used to lecture constantly about reputation, integrity, legacy. I remembered being 16 while he explained why trust is the only currency that survives recessions. And now Arthur sat calmly inside my apartment telling me the entire empire was partially constructed on fraud. I gripped the edge of the counter hard. My entire internal history was rearranging itself in real time. Every moment. Every time Jada escaped consequences. Time when financial inconsistency disappeared mysteriously. Every time my father redirected audits away from certain departments. It all suddenly aligned. Then Arthur said something even worse. Alyssa, there's another reason they targeted you specifically. I turned slowly. What reason? He opened another folder. Inside were internal board recommendations, executive succession discussions, private voting notes. And there, highlighted repeatedly, was my name. Arthur spoke carefully. Several investors wanted you to replace your father operationally within 2 years. I stared at him silently, because nobody ever told me that. Not once. Arthur continued. You were respected internally.
Stable. Precise.
Ethical. Unlike Jada. The implication hung heavily between us. Then Arthur delivered the sentence that finally shattered whatever remained emotionally intact inside me. Your father believed if regulators started investigating deeply, investors might remove both him and Jada while promoting you as corrective leadership. I whispered. So, they destroyed me first. Arthur nodded once. Quietly. Yes. That night changed me permanently. Not dramatically. Not loudly. Quietly. Like ice forming. Because once the emotional shock settled, clarity arrived underneath it. My family had already decided my role. Scapegoat.
Containment strategy.
Disposable daughter. Which meant emotional appeals were useless now. Truth alone mattered. And truth required evidence. I barely slept. Instead, I spent hours reviewing every archived report still accessible through personal backups I'd kept over the years. That decision alone eventually saved me. Because unlike Jada, I documented everything. Meticulously. By 3:40 a.m., patterns began emerging. Duplicate vendor chains. Circular payments. Artificial delays masking transfers. And repeatedly, Marrow Holdings, Jada's shell company. But what terrified me most wasn't the fraud itself. It was the realization that somebody inside legal had been helping structure protections around it, which meant this went deeper than family greed. This was corporate crime. At nearly midnight, my phone buzzed again. Ethan, my younger brother, the only person in the family who hadn't publicly attacked me yet. I answered cautiously. Hey. His voice sounded strained. Alyssa, are you okay? I almost laughed from exhaustion.
No.
Long silence. Then quietly, I don't think you did this. That hurt more than certainty would have. Because even Ethan sounded unsure now. Then why didn't you say anything earlier? I didn't know what was happening. You still don't. Another silence. Then he whispered, Dad's terrified. I froze slightly. Terrified of what? I heard him yelling at Jada tonight. That got my attention instantly. What about? Ethan hesitated. Then, he kept asking what she did with the Cayman accounts. My pulse hammered hard. Because normal accounting fraud doesn't involve offshore panic. And suddenly I realized something critical. The family was no longer unified internally. Cracks were forming. Fear was spreading, which meant pressure was working. The next morning, I received an official termination notice from Sterling Developments, delivered by courier. Not email.
Not HR. Courier. Cold.
Legal. Deliberate. Inside the envelope was also a cease and desist order warning me against sharing proprietary financial information or confidential internal records. I sat at my dining table staring at the documents while sunlight slowly crept across the floorboards. Then I noticed something strange. The legal timestamp. The documents had been prepared 3 days before my parents sent the original message. 3 days. Meaning they had already planned my removal before publicly accusing me. Before investigations escalated. Before speaking to me once. And suddenly one final realization landed with absolute certainty. They never intended to find the truth. Because they already knew it. That evening, Arthur called again.
His voice sounded sharper this time.
Alyssa, listen carefully. My chest tightened instantly. What happened? The SEC officially opened inquiry requests this morning. I closed my eyes slowly. It was starting. Arthur continued. And there's something else. What? Long pause. Then, Jada's trying to move money out of the country tonight. The room went completely silent. Because if she was fleeing assets now, then somebody inside the family knew collapse was no longer avoidable. And for the first time since all this began, I realized something terrifying. My sister might not just destroy the company. She might destroy all of us trying to save herself. The first thing I did after Arthur's call was lock every document I had into 3 separate encrypted backups. Not because I was paranoid, because by then I finally understood the scale of what my family was willing to do to survive. And survival changes people, especially wealthy people with reputations attached to entire industries. Outside my apartment, Chicago rain hammered against the windows in uneven waves while traffic lights smeared red and white across wet glass. Inside, my dining table looked like a federal investigation board. Transaction timelines, corporate filings, vendor trees, highlighted names, shell companies, wire paths. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fixing one of my family's problems.
I was documenting it.
And strangely, that clarity made me calmer. By morning, one truth became unavoidable. Jada hadn't created the fraud system. She was too reckless for something this structured.
No.
She inherited it,
Expanded it.
abused it, but the architecture itself? That belonged to my father. The realization hit hardest when I uncovered property rotation patterns dating back almost 11 years. Small manipulations at first. Inflated consulting invoices. Construction delays used to justify emergency reallocations. Then eventually offshore vendor loops. Everything designed carefully enough to survive surface audits. But greed always expands. And greed leaves fingerprints. Especially when family members start believing they're untouchable. Arthur arrived again the following evening carrying another stack of documents. He looked more tense this time. Less like an advisor. More like a man watching a building burn while knowing people were still trapped inside. The second he sat down, he asked, "Has anyone contacted you privately?" My mother tried twice. "You didn't answer?"
No.
Good. That single word landed heavily.
Good.
Meaning communication itself had become dangerous. Arthur loosened his tie slightly. The SEC subpoena requests accelerated faster than expected. How bad is it? He looked directly at me. Bad enough that your father's legal team started preparing separation arguments. I frowned. Separation arguments? They're positioning Jada independently now. Cold spread slowly through my chest. So, he's sacrificing her too. Arthur gave a tired nod. If necessary. That silence afterward felt uglier than shouting. Because somewhere underneath all the money and legal strategy, this was still a father dismantling his own children to preserve himself. People imagine betrayal as explosive. But the worst kind is procedural. Emails, signatures, strategic silence. Watching people calculate your value in real time. And sitting there across from Arthur, I realized something painful. My father didn't love conditionally. He managed conditionally. Affection in our family had always followed usefulness. Jada received admiration because she reflected status. I received approval because I solved problems. But the second survival required a sacrifice. Love became negotiable. That afternoon, I remembered something suddenly. 3 years earlier, during one of Sterling's office renovations, several archived finance boxes had been moved temporarily into private storage. Most were later destroyed officially, supposedly. But I handled the transfer inventory personally. And one detail bothered me now. The destruction logs were incomplete. I drove 40 minutes south through freezing rain toward an industrial storage facility outside Cicero. Gray concrete, chain link fencing, security lights flickering against puddles. The kind of place nobody notices, which makes it perfect for hiding things. Inside the office, an older clerk looked up lazily. "Can I help you?" I slid over an old archive reference number. "I need to confirm whether this unit was emptied." He typed slowly.
Paused.
Then frowned. Huh. What? This one was never formally closed. My pulse slowed immediately. Not faster. Slower. Because instincts were confirming themselves now. The clerk handed me a temporary access code. And 20 minutes later, standing inside Unit 4B beneath humming fluorescent lights, I found 12 archive boxes still sealed in Sterling Developments tape. Boxes my father claimed no longer existed. Dust coated everything. The air smelled stale and metallic. I crouched beside the nearest box and carefully cut through old packing tape. Inside, original accounting ledgers, vendor agreements, board review drafts, and handwritten annotations from my father. Real ones. Not edited digital copies. Not curated files. Originals. I flipped pages carefully until one specific folder stopped me cold. Marrow Holdings. Internal liability structure. Liability structure. Not investment venture. Not subsidiary. Liability structure. Meaning Marrow Holdings existed specifically to absorb risk. My hands trembled slightly for the first time in days. Then I opened the folder. And there it was. My father's signature authorizing layered transfers through Jada's shell company.
Directly.
Repeatedly. For years. Not accidental ignorance. Not negligence. Participation. I sat back slowly against the cold storage wall. Because suddenly the entire family narrative collapsed completely. Dad wasn't protecting Jada. He built Jada. My phone rang while I was still inside the storage unit. Jada. For a second, I considered ignoring it. Then I answered. Her voice sounded different immediately. Not polished. Not controlled. Frantic. Alyssa, where are you? Interesting. Not hello. Not how are you. Where are you? Why? Dad said you've been talking to Arthur. I stayed silent. Jada lowered her voice. You need to stop. Or what? Alyssa, you don't understand what's happening. I nearly laughed at that. No, I understand perfectly now. Long silence. Then, you think Dad's protecting me? That got my attention. What does that mean? Another silence. And suddenly I heard it.
Fear.
Real fear. Then Jada whispered. He's already preparing to blame both of us. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while rain rattled faintly against the storage roof. I spoke carefully now. You forged my approvals.
No.
Immediate answer. Too immediate. Then who did? She didn't respond. Instead, she whispered. You need to leave this alone before somebody gets criminally buried.
Somebody.
Not us.
Somebody.
That wording mattered. Then she hung up. For the first time since this started, I realized Jada might not fully control the situation either, which complicated everything. Because if my father had begun repositioning against her too, then panic inside Sterling Developments was escalating faster than I thought. And panic creates mistakes. Mistakes create evidence. Meaning I didn't need emotional revenge anymore. I needed patience. 2 days later, another story hit local business media.